We are recording. Fantastic. Again, it's 11:59, right ahead of our start time, so we'll get started in just a moment. I see somebody in the chat is already thinking about next week's opener and the amount of snow that there are in parts of the state. Going to need snowshoes for opener. It might not be a bad idea in some spots. All right, it is 12 o'clock. It is Wednesday. This is the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. My name is James Burnham. I am the Recruitment, Retention, and Reactivation Coordinator for the state of Minnesota. And with me today is our Northwoods guru, the one, the only, the man, the myth, the legend, Craig Kiger.
Hey
Craig,
guys.
say hi to everybody. Craig, and I just want to get confirmation. You can see my slide. It's constructed. It's good.
Yep, looks good.
Fantastic. All right. So this webinar is part of an ongoing webinar series. This is number 106, and I feel pretty good that our very first webinar way back in March of 2021 was about turkeys, and today we're talking about turkeys. So this is a weekly webinar that's been running for 106 episodes. Our recordings get posted on our YouTube channel, so if you registered for this site, you'll get a link to that, and you can access it through the registration page where you got to hear originally. These webinars are it's a chance for you to learn new stuff that's specific to Minnesota, a chance for you to engage with presenters that know about this stuff, have real-time back and forth, and try to sift through some of the information that's out there. There's a lot of information out there. We're trying to make things easier for people to get engaged and participate. It's 3 days from 3 minutes to an hour. Usually it's more like an hour. And our goal is for you to learn about the hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation opportunities you have across Minnesota, share how we, the DNR, manage the state's wildlands and wildlife, and give tips on how you can be stewards of the natural resources that surround you. Topics, we've got some great stuff coming up. We've got trout stream easements. That's a fantastic topic to get access to some really quality trout fishing that Minnesota is, pretty dang good with. We've got some really, really nice trout fishing here in the state. On the 19th, we've got peregrine falcons. On the 26th, we've got the cold water fisheries of the state. We're going to follow that up at the beginning of May with fishing for sheepshead, which is a tremendous native fish that we've got here in the state. And then we're going to go to the granddaddy of them all before the governor's fishing opener for fishing for walleye. After that, we're going to switch over to how you can help baby wildlife. We're going to talk about some monarch butterfly conservation towards the end of May, and then we're going to delve into some musky secrets and get into those elusive fish. So, what are we talking about today? Today is Talking Turkey, where you're going to be talking about calls, how to do it, what they are, where they're at, how you use them, and hopefully I want to get through this PowerPoint presentation as quickly as possible so I can get to the actual calls themselves. I can answer some questions, and we can really get into it. And just really quickly, all of this is kind of for new folks that are starting out. If you haven't called before, if you just started out, this content is more oriented towards you, and hopefully we can help you get out there and get in the woods and get onto some birds. I am not a distinguished caller. I don't have a big resume of winning multiple calling championships. I don't, once you get into this world, you hear people say, I come from the so-and-so calling tree. That's not me. I'm just a guy who gets out there and gets birds and calls, and, all of this is what I have learned in my journey as a turkey hunter, and I'm trying to share that with you. When I started out, it was kind of overwhelming why there are so many calls. And it's a lot like fishing lures. Sometimes birds respond to one call and they won't respond to another. Sometimes they hear one type of call a lot and they're used to it and they know to ignore it. And sometimes they don't hear another call very frequently and they're like, oh, hello, yes, I will come over there. The whole point of this is so that we as hunters can mimic a hen. You know, turkey hunting is ridiculous. We dress up like a bush to sound like a female to get a male to come in. And that's the math that we're doing. So all of this is to mimic a hen so that we can get a male, a tom turkey, to come in and into a range and get a good shot. Now that's anywhere from 20 to 40 yards depending on how comfortable you are with your ammo and what your setup is, but that's not very far. And so we're really trying to use that sound to bring them in and get an ethical shot on them. Different calls have different trade-offs, so there's a huge range. I mean, again, like fishing lures, you know, you've got some lures that are good for one situation, some lures that are good for another. There's just trade-offs with all this stuff. And it's really going to be up to you to find the ones that work for you and your setup and your context and your situation. And be able and confident as you can be going into the woods. And then the big question is, how many calls do I need? If you're just starting out on this, keep it simple. Start with one or two, build from there, find what works for you, get practiced. You know, it's a lot better to be really good with the tool that you have than to have a whole bunch of tools that you're not very good with, if that makes sense. So find the call or calls that work for you and get good with it. You know, some years I only need one call. You know, the picture in the slide right now, that was a bird, and that was the only call I used that day. Now I had 12 calls in my vest that day. I didn't touch them. But sometimes you only need one. Sometimes you need all 12. For me, at least, I should say I need all 12 sometimes. But, you know, it's just, that's why we do it, because it's interesting and it's challenging and it's fun. What calls do you need to make? Again, this is more for people who are just starting. You know, turkeys make a lot of different vocalizations. They're very communicative out in the woods. Start by learning the sounds that mean a turkey is comfortable, or a turkey is excited, or a turkey is looking for other turkeys. And those calls are, you know, your yelp call is going to be your bread and butter. If you only need one call, learn that one. That means it's turkeys out looking for other turkeys. Purrs are really great comfort call. They can be pretty easy to do, and it really just means that that bird is comfortable, not easy breezy, beautiful, nothing's a challenge, there's no stress around. Those are really good signals to send out, because if you're talking to a tom and you're making sounds like, hey, everything's gravy where I'm at, I don't have to worry about anything, there's definitely no danger sitting nearby, that's a great call to have. Cutting is an excitement call that can be very useful for challenging another hen. It's not necessarily a warning call, but it's basically like, hey, what is going on? You know, turkeys have a pecking order, literally. They have a pecking order where they have a dominant hen and subdominant hens. And cutting is really a way for that dominant hen to come in and try to assert her authority, to put down any sort of squabbles or fights that are going on amongst the flock. And so if you can cut at a hen and she cuts back at you and she starts coming in close, that is a really good tactic, because frequently there will be a tom or a jake that is following her, waiting for her to breed. Clucks can be great. It's a really good communication tool between turkeys. It's basically just like, hey, I'm here, yep, I'm here, hey, I'm over here, yep, I'm over here now. They're frequently intermixed with yelps, and those yelps, again, it's kind of that searching call, like, hey, where is everybody? I'm over here. Hey, where is everybody? I'm over here. Clucks can be tricky when you're first starting out, because if you do a cluck incorrectly, it can really veer into a putt, which is a warning call, which you don't really want to do, because you don't want that tom coming in and you're yelping and you're purring and you're like, oh my gosh, where are the other birds? And oh, things are so comfortable over here, and then all of a sudden you're sending up an audio red flag with a putt when you're trying to cluck. So I tell people, you know, if you're going to start with yelps, go to purrs. I put clucks lower down on the level because, again, they can be hard to implement. They can be hard to deliver correctly without it being a putt. Whenever I cluck, I almost always have it be like a yelp, a cluck, a yelp, a purr, a yelp. Like I want to make sure that those other signals are in there instead of just a cluck, because especially when you're excited, especially when you're, you know, not sure what's going on, if you just do a quick cluck, it can come out a little too forceful, it can come out a little too aggressive, and it turns into a putt, and then the birds are looking for trouble, and you don't want that. Kikis and kiki runs, these are more common in the fall. You can hear them in the later spring after a brood has hatched, and they're really kind of a gathering call for young birds. It's kind of like, hey, let's circle the wagons, let's get in. You know, it's a lot like when you, if you've ever chaperoned a school field trip, you know, you've got that tone of your voice where you're like, everybody, let's go, let's get in line. That's what a kiki and a kiki run is, and those are kind of specialized calls. And if you're just starting out, put them way down your list of things to learn, because you know you can get really far with yelps and purrs and cutting. So where to start? If you've never gone turkey hunting, if you've never called before, where do you start? It's so overwhelming. I've seen, like, you do a Google search for turkey calls and it's just pages and pages and pages and videos and videos and videos. And if you need somewhere to start, if you're going to grab one call, if you've never done this before, grab a push button call. This is not an electronic device. It's just a wooden call or a plastic call, and they're really versatile, they're really effective, they're really inexpensive, they're really easy to use. So grab that push button call if that's where you're going to start. That's my advice. Now, some people will have other opinions, and that's totally fine, but I really do think that learning curve is really, really low with a push button call. You're going to get your yelps, you're going to get your purrs, you're going to get some clucks, and you know it's really a great place to start. The one disadvantage of a push button call is that they can be quiet. So if you really want to augment that and get more loud, you know, grab a box call, and that will really broadcast your location. You'll be able to get a lot of volume out of it. They do yelps really, really well, and you can use those yelps, get a bird interested, get a bird coming in, switch over to your push button, get some purrs in, get them really, really interested, and come in and get your bird. Because as we all know, when we go out in the woods, everything goes totally according to plan. But those are the two calls that I would recommend. If you haven't ever gotten started with this, if you're looking for a place to start, those are my two recommendations, because they are both very easy to use. You can get a lot of versatility out of them, and you can get that volume out of those box calls when you need it. I said earlier that calling is about trade-offs, and this is my attempt at trying to concisely represent that. You know, when you're talking about calls, when I think about calls, I think about the volume, I think about the versatility of the call and how many calls I can get out of one device. I think about the visibility of that call, how much motion does it take to operate that call, how many hands do I need to operate that call, and then I think about the ease of use. Those are the four things that I really think about when I'm looking at calls. And again, this is, you know, the minus signs mean that they're bad in that area, and the plus signs mean that they're good in that area. So we talk about those push buttons. They're very versatile. They don't require a lot of visibility. You can use them with one hand, one finger even. They're very easy to use. They're a great beginner call. They're a great place to start. I don't want to say beginner call, because I still use push buttons every once in a while, because like I said, sometimes they just respond to different calls, and you don't know until you try it. Box calls, they're very loud. The versatility with box calls is a little less. Like, I have a hard time purring with box calls. I know it can be done. It's just one of those things that you've got to kind of be careful with it, and it's really easy to make unintentional noise when you're trying to purr with a box call. The visibility is the big strike against box calls. They take two hands. And if you've got a bird coming in, if you're calling and you've got a bird coming in that you know about, you know, that's one thing. But the tricky part is you can be calling and you don't hear anything, and you can be calling and you don't hear anything, and you're sitting there with a box call, and there's a bird coming up behind you real sneaky like, because every so often there's one of those real quiet ones that'll just kind of creep in on you like a ninja. And you're sitting here using your box call with two hands, and then you go to put your call down, and that motion, if you're not in a blind, that motion will catch their eye and they'll flush, and you won't know they're there until they're flying off through the woods. So box calls kind of take a hit with the visibility. They take a lot of motion. Pot calls are they can be very loud. They can be very versatile. They do require two hands usually, so they get a knock on the detectability. The ease of use is also, there's a little bit of a learning curve with pot calls. Diaphragm calls, the ones that go inside your mouth. I love them. They're extremely versatile. There's zero hands that are involved. They can be loud. The real challenge with them is that they can be hard to learn how to use and find the ones that fit you. And then we have tube calls that are also loud and versatile. They do require hands to operate, but they're a little easier to use than diaphragm calls. And then our trumpet wingbone calls are kind of a separate entity, but they do get loud and they are pretty easy to use. So with calls, we've got two broad categories, and I'm going to kind of run through these, and then I'm going to stop the PowerPoint so that we can be full screen and I can demonstrate some of this stuff. But we've got these broad categories of calls. You've got friction calls, and that requires rubbing things together because it takes friction to make sound. Or you have mouth calls that involve using your mouth to operate the call. And I just saw a question come through in the chat. What are pot calls? Are they slate calls? Yes, that's another name for what people call slate calls. Pot calls is a little more general because sometimes it's not made out of slate. So if it's a slate call that's made out of slate, absolutely. If it's made out of some other material, then it's a pot call. And I'll get into those in a moment.
Let's just remind everybody.
Mouth calls involve using.
Quick, James, put your questions in Q&A. It's a lot easier for us to navigate. Thank you.
Yep, good point, Craig. Yeah, the chat is going to be kind of where we're going to put links and what have you, but the Q&A is actually where it's easier for us to see those questions and navigate them. Mouth calls involve using your mouth somehow to operate. Usually it's blowing out, but with trumpet or wing bones, you're kind of actually sucking in a little bit. So you are using your mouth. There's a wide range of materials and styles that are involved, but you're using air to vibrate something, either a reed or a piece of latex or your lips. So getting into it, friction calls, there's a wide variety. Some are louder than others. Most friction calls require two hands. Most require some sort of conditioning, and by conditioning it means either, for box calls you can chalk up the surface to make the friction more intense, or you can scuff up the surface of your pot call or slate call. So it requires some conditioning. Many are not usable in wet or rainy conditions. You're talking about rubbing things together to make noise, and if it gets wet, you're not gonna have them to make that sound. The trade-off with them, the bonus is they're usually easier to use than most mouth calls, and we kind of went over that a little bit with our box call and our push button. But getting into those, the push button, how does it work? It's a piece of wood that is in this kind of container, this little box, and it's attached to a plunger or a stick, and there's a spring in there, and you press down on the plunger and it rubs that piece of wood across another piece of wood, and that's what's generating the sound. And that spring pushes it back up, and so literally all you need to do to use a push button call is move your index finger. Very easy to learn how to use. Usually they have a one-handed operation. You can make a good range of calls with these. They can be really inexpensive. It's a great place to start. But again, the trade-off is they're typically quieter. They can be hard to use when it's wet and it's raining, and you can make unintended noise with them. If they're in your vest and they're rattling around, they can sit there and be, that plunger could be moving back and forth across the striking surface, and you could be making yelps without meaning to, or just random sounds, and sometimes that's not a good thing. Box calls, again, these are friction calls, and it's a flat piece of wood over a elongated rectangle box, and it's usually attached with a hinge at one end. These can be very loud. They're really great. If you get out to a spot and you have no idea what the bird is standing on some high ground, just hit that box call, and hopefully you hear a gobbler in the distance and you've got some idea of where you're trying to go. They're very easy to learn how to use. They can be waterproof. They do make box calls that are made with waterproof treatments on them, so that's very helpful. I have found them to be limited to the kinds of calls that I make with them. Like I said earlier, I'm really bad with purring with them without making unintended noise because the technique that it requires to just kind of gently rub it across to purr, I frequently am hitting it again as I come back. So it's like a purr, it's like a purr with a hiccup in it. And that doesn't make me feel good as a hunter. Like that doesn't sound like I've never heard a turkey with hiccups. And so that feels weird to me. These definitely require two hands to use, and again, these can also make unintended noise. So if you've got this in your vest or your backpack and you're walking around, and so in this picture you can see there's a little Scotch scrub pad and a rubber band. I will lock that box call down with that rubber band over that Scotch pad so that even if it moves, it's not going to be striking. So I'm not going to get these little squeaks as I walk or something when I go through the woods. So be aware of that when you're using them. Our pot calls are slate calls, so this can be a material it can be slate, that's the standard material, but it can be acrylic, it can be ceramic, it can be metal, and that's placed over some sort of sounding chamber, and then you've got a striker, which is kind of pencil shaped, and you're drawn on that substrate, and so that's how you're making the friction, that's how you're getting the calls on that, and it can be very loud. There's a huge range of calls you can do with it. It can be very versatile. The really sweet thing about pot calls is depending on the type of call, the substrate you have, depending on the striker you're using, very quickly, those different combinations are going to produce different sounds. And they're going to be really subtle, but turkeys can hear that subtlety. And so, you might have the exact same pot call that you're using, but you switch out the strikers, and now all of a sudden you've got a bird on you. So you can diversify your sound portfolio really quickly with just like one or two pot calls and then 3 or 4 strikers, and then you've got a really big range of noises that you can make. Again, they're subtle, but the birds are going to pick up on it. When you start with these, you're basically just drawing tight little circles on them, and I'll get into those when we get through the PowerPoint, and then you can move to and those are going to be your yelps, and then you can move into these upside down J shapes, and I'm right-handed, so the hook of the J is pointed to my right in this slide, and so you're going to make those kind of upside down J shapes, and those are going to be your clucks. These can be waterproof with the right combination, so like your acrylic surface, your ceramic surface, depending on what striker you're using, those can be waterproof. Slate is notoriously forgiving for learning how to make these sounds, but it's also notorious for being finicky. I mean, I've had slate calls in a moderate dew that just wouldn't work because there was just too much condensation on them. So, keeping those slate calls very, 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 very dry is going to be important if you're using slate. The trade-offs with these, they still require two hands. Like I said, almost all of them require some sort of conditioning. I know there's some metal ones that are out there that you can kind of get away with without scuffing them up. And different materials have to be scuffed up with different scuffers, for lack of a better description. I've got some really aggressive heavy grit sandpaper that I attack my acrylic call that I would not touch on my ceramic call. So just be aware that you can't, it's not just grab whatever old sandpaper is in the drawer and go at it, because it's a good way to ruin some calls. I kind of talked about it just a second ago. Different surfaces are more or less forgiving to learn on. Slate calls with a really nice wood striker, those are pretty easy. You can get the hang of those pretty quick. Some of the acrylic, some of the other strikers, some of the ceramic, those can be a little tricky, and those are going to take some practice. All right, so moving to mouth calls. This is an even more variety with a range of different materials. I mean, basically anything that you can think of could potentially be a mouth call, and there's a lot of different. I mean, every year it's like there's a different type of magical mouth call that just brings them all in, and they love it, and so there's a lot out there. There's typically more range in call types and versatility. I have found, this is my personal opinion, almost all of them are waterproof, so these are really good for wet or crummy weather calls. So even if you're not very good with one, it might be good to have one just in your bag in case it's a drizzle or it's opener in Minnesota and it's a blizzard, because those things happen here. The detectability on these tend to be a little better. They usually only require one hand. Most diaphragm calls that go into your mouth um, are zero hand operation. The trade-off is they can be a little bit more tricky to learn as than the friction calls. But the nice thing is that you can actually combine these calls with friction calls to imitate more than one bird at once. And I just saw the chat go by. Yes, we are going to get to demonstrations on this. Tube calls, it's just a thin layer of latex that stretch across an open tube or pill bottle, and you're literally just kind of blowing right across it, and it makes some really good calls. It's a wide range of calls and volume. They're waterproof, one-handed operation. You can even make these out of an old pill bottle, or if anybody has some antique film equipment lying around, camera equipment, you can make these out of an old film canister for the old-timey film in cameras. This can be a little tricky to use well, and it's not as common as some of the other calls. Diaphragm calls, these actually go inside your mouth. This is one or more layers of latex. They stretch across this really tiny frame, and they fit in your mouth, and you vibrate whenever air goes across it. If you're going to start with these, be prepared. I mean, these take some work. If you've never done mouth calls before, when I started with mouth calls, I was slobbering like a hound dog on a bad day. I mean, just drool, just coming out of the mouth. And so, be ready for that. Be ready for it to feel really uncomfortable. And you're just going to have to practice it, work through it, find calls that fit you. If you're starting with mouth calls, with diaphragm calls, start with the fewest number of latex that you can find. Diaphragm calls are a lot like men's razor blades. They're always adding more layers. They're always adding one more. Now with 4 layers, and it's like, okay. Start with as few layers of latex as you can find. There's still people that are making single reed latex diaphragm calls. Try to find one of those. They tend to be easier to learn how to use. These are zero hand operation. You can, absolutely stone still and make some tremendous calls with these. They're usually fairly inexpensive. And the trade-offs, again, they can be hard to learn how to use well, so thankfully they're not really expensive usually. And it can be hard to find ones that fit in your mouth well. We all have different shaped mouths. Some people have small mouths, some people have big mouths. Some of these diaphragm calls are made out of this thick foam. Some of them have this big plastic sounding chamber on them. Like you're going to have to play around and find the one that works, the one or ones that work for you, and then really kind of dive into it. And then our trumpet or wingbone calls. These are the other mouth calls that I've been talking about. These are calls that you're blowing out to vibrate that latex reed. And with trumpet calls, it's a hollow tube, and it can be made out of turkey bones. It can be made out of acrylic or plastic, and you're actually sucking into it to vibrate your lips on the opening of that hollow tube. I think it's really cool that we can make these out of turkeys that we harvest, and I've made several myself. These can make a fairly unique sound out in the woods. There are a lot of times where I've had birds that have completely ignored all my other calls, and then they'll answer to this one because it's just not something they hear very often. There aren't a whole lot of folks that are using these first when they're in the woods. They can be, I have a fewer range of calls possible with these. I don't know how to purr on a trumpet call, and they take at least one hand to operate. So, and if they're made out of wing bone, they can, if you take a fall and land on it, you can break it. So they can be a little fragile. So again, I'm trying to get us to where I can demonstrate some of the stuff, and then we can get to questions. It's all about the trade-offs that work for you. Find the tool that you're comfortable with. Find the tool that you feel good about, and you can get out there and get some birds to answer to you. It's really, this time of year, the birds are fired up. I've heard turkeys gobble at a car door slamming. Like don't put too much stress on the fact that, I'm not good enough of a caller. That's probably not true. I've heard some really terrible sounding birds. I had a hen creep up on me that I swore was the world's worst box call operator, and the next thing I know, this hen is literally in my lap, and she just sounded awful. And I kind of wanted her to go take some voice lessons or something. But, be forgiving to yourself. This is not as hard as some of the stuff is made out to be. You can get a box call and get birds to answer to you pretty quick. calling tips, focus on mimicking the birds you find outside. We all turn to the internet for answers. You want to sound like turkeys. You don't want to sound like other people making turkey sounds. And that's an important distinction because this, like I said, birds hear and process audio information much quicker than we do. So you really want to sound like those birds. If you want to watch somebody demonstrate a call because you want to learn how to use that call and how they're using it, that's fine. But focus on finding bird sounds to imitate. Boss hens, the top of the pecking order, they typically won't tolerate a challenger. Repeat her sounds as closely as possible. If you have no idea the cadence, the rhythm, the timing that you're trying to use, if you hear a hen yelp, sit there and count it. Be like, okay, she just yelped 4 times. I'm going to yelp back 4 times. And if she gets mad, she's going to yelp again. Just match her call for call. That'll fire her up typically, and she's going to want to come in, and she may have a tom behind her. If you do look up sounds online, this is something that a lot of people that aren't bird nerds, they don't know. Birds can have regional dialects. I grew up down in Georgia. The cardinals down there sound different than the cardinals up here. The turkeys down there sound a little different than the turkeys up here. Find recordings or online content from as close to where you're hunting as possible. You want to sound like the birds that are in those areas. So find those recordings, and don't just accept some turkey call from western New Mexico, because they're going to sound a little different than the birds up here in Minnesota, and the birds up here may not respond as well. And focus on those bird recordings and less on people recordings. If you want more hunting tips, this isn't a how-to hunt. I want to get to the calls. We've got a lot of great material on our webpage. We've got Learn to Hunt Turkey short course that we did back in 2020. It's over 4 hours of information. We've got our how-to hunting guide, tips and tricks, and if you just do a search for MNDNR Learn to Hunt Turkey, you'll get to that page, and you can get some information. So with that being said, I'll get to the questions. I want to stop this presentation and go over some of the calls with everybody. I just want to, Craig, can we just take a quick peek in the Q&A if there's anything that needs addressing real quick? I see one question from David. In the beginning you mentioned an electronic call. Are electronic calls legal to use? Not for turkeys in Minnesota. A lot of states handle that differently, but here in Minnesota, electronic calls for turkeys are not legal. So there's been some confusion when you use the term push button call. Some people default to these electronic call makers, and there's some confusion in that regard. But yeah, so that's why I wanted to make sure that people didn't run out and buy an electronic call. And then Steven in the chat, some mouth calls have more rasp than others. What are your thoughts? It depends. I've heard really, this is going to get weird, and some of this, whenever you describe sound to people, weird descriptions get used. So just forewarning, please, I've heard some really sweet sounding turkeys. The calls are really clear. There's almost no rasp to them. And I've heard some raspy old turkeys, raspy old birds that are just full of buzz in them. And I've called in birds both ways. So it really, again, if I hear a really raspy bird in the distance, I'm going to put in a raspy mouth call and try to imitate that bird. If I hear a really clear toned bird in the distance, I'm going to put in a clear toned mouth call and try to work with that. So it's really kind of situational on what I'm hearing. So with that being said, I've got some calls here. So this is our push button call, and again, this is some of that unintended noise that I was talking about. If this is bouncing around in your pack, turkeys are going to hear that and they're going to run. But it's a really easy call. So here's that piece of wood, and you can see down in there's the striking surface, and you can see the spring that's attached to it, and so those are just some short yelps. So a little bit of purrs, some really gentle cutting. One of the really nice things about these, again, because it's one-handed operation, I've seen more than a couple of guys who will actually tie this to the side of their shotgun, and they'll either put a string on this plunger, or they'll just have it within arm's reach, and you can sit there and you can hold your shotgun and make calls. So very, very versatile, really great place to start. And sometimes these are made totally out of wood, sometimes there's some plastic housing, pretty inexpensive. I just saw in the chat, do you use a gobbler call? I do not. I know a lot of people that do. I tend to hunt on public land, and I have a pretty rigid rule that I don't want to sound like the thing that other people are trying to shoot, so I don't use gobble calls. But I know people who do, and I know they have a lot of success with them. So that's just my personal philosophy on it. So that was our push button call, really easy. We've got our box calls, and again, you can see I've got mine. This isn't making sound. If this is loose in your vest or pack, it's making sound. So lock it up. And this is my waterproof one, and you can see there's a special surface that's been treated, and there's another striking surface, and it just makes noise, and you can sit here and you hold it with one hand, and the way I hold it is I put my index finger over here, and then I'm just going. And I should say, if you're wearing headphones right now, maybe turn the volume down. I really apologize if I just perforated any eardrums, because, I mean, that was gentle and it's very loud. So, you know, you're just kind of sitting there. Now again, even when you're, I mean, these are still making noise, so you gotta watch it, because you don't want to give away any unintended noise when you're making calls. That's my waterproof one. My non-waterproof one, this requires chalk to be put on the inside, that pink stuff. Chalk, and then it's rubbed against this other piece of wood. Same principle. And you can hear there's a difference between those two calls. They don't sound the same. My waterproof one was a little higher pitch, a little more nasally, for lack of a description. This one's a little more rounded. So, very easy to use, very loud, very effective at finding birds that are way in the distance, and with low learning curve. Our pot calls. So I've got 3 here. This is my ceramic one. It's a ceramic surface, and really don't want to put your finger oils on these, so I'm just tapping it with my fingernail. For ceramic, I've got my slate call with wood. And then I've got my acrylic plastic one, and this one's got a little cover on it. And you can see this is what it looks like scuffed up, and this is what it looks like when it's clear. So when you first get this, it's going to be clear. That doesn't make noise. Up here, that makes noise. So you got to scuff it up. You got to condition it. So those are my 3 acrylic calls. So I'll go with a slate, and sometimes I'll even scuff up. So a striker, I'll even scuff up the striker on my Scotch pad, just rough it up a little bit. And I got my slate call, and I'm just going to draw tiny circles. Now, depending on how big you're making those circles, you can do a Jake yelp or a Tom yelp or a hen yelp. But when you're first starting out, you don't really need to focus on those distinctions. Just kind of, I'm holding this like a pencil. Tiny circles. Now when I'm holding this, I'm holding it so that that sound chamber can have sound come out of it. I'm not holding it flat against my palm. So give that room, give that sound some room to come out, not tight against your palm. And when I'm doing this, I'm not touching the call. It's just that. And the nice thing about these is You know, you got your yelps. Oh. There we go. Those can be clucks. Now, if you do them a little too aggressive, they get into that putt territory, and you don't want that. And your different pot calls are going to have, people call them the sweet spot. You're going to have to like search around. So if we do, that's really high, that's really squeaky, but if we come down here, it's not as squeaky, it's a little better sounding. So search around on those pot calls to find the sweet spot, find where that tone is. It really sounds good. With conditioning these, with slate calls, you can just do the scrubby, and with conditioning them, you always want to rub, you don't want to do circles, right? You always want to rub back and forth in the same direction. So that will be sufficient for a slate call, is one of these little scrubbies. For my ceramic calls, I have a small piece of kind of coarse but not super coarse sandpaper that I'll use to scuff this one up. And then for my acrylic call, I've got this really high test sandpaper to get those scruffs going. For these, because you want that conditioning always in the same way, it's kind of hard when it's a circle. So I file a notch in the top of my pot calls so that even in the dark, I can feel that notch and I can say, okay, that's 12 o'clock, that's pointed up, and I can continue my conditioning in the same way that I've always done it, and then I can do my calls. So kind of file a notch, and it's easier to do. I don't do that in my slate call because this is a nice wood call and I didn't want to file a notch in it, but slate is so easy to condition, that's not as important to me. It's more important to keep it looking pretty, looking good. But yeah, I file a notch. If it's a perfectly round call and there's no other way to tell how I'm holding it, I'll file a notch in it so that I can know where the conditioning is so that I can keep using it. So I showed what wooden, here I'm going to show, so this is with a wooden striker on this ceramic call. Now it sounds different, it's a little deeper, it's a little raspier. Now this is a striker with an aluminum tip, this is a metal tip. Now between the ceramic and this metal tip, this will work in the rain. And that sounds a little different, it sounds more, I mean, for lack of a better description, it sounds more metallic, it's got a little sharper edge to it. So that's what this is. You can use, this is a striker that's just got a carbon tip. If you got any old broke carbon arrows at home, you could use one of those as a striker. Ooh. So it sounds different. It was a little shrieky there for a second because my technique wasn't so good. But again, carbon tip, ceramic slate, ceramic pot call, this will work in the rain. Alright, so those are my friction calls. I want to do mouth calls really quick and then I want to get into the Q&A. Our diaphragm calls, I've got a whole bunch, but again, this is kind of a really great beginner call. It's got 2 reeds on it. It's flexible plastic frame. It's this thin kind of athletic tape that goes in your mouth. These are really good. One tip with diaphragm calls, they're usually going to have some sort of bump on the bottom of the frame, and I can't really pick that out, but you'll feel it and you'll see it. That goes down towards your tongue if you've never used one of these before. And you put it in the roof of your mouth so that your tongue is underneath it, and you can make some calls. Tremendous amount of versatility, tremendous amount of calls you can get done with them. This has no These are just straight pieces of latex. We talked earlier about some calls are raspier than others. That's because they're like this call, and you can see there's this jagged cut in the call, and just like everything else, you know, people who play around with what kind of jagged cuts they use, what the configuration is, how many layers of latex are being used, and it really comes down to what works for you. So this one, this is called, you can see it kind of has that, they call it a bat wing cut, where it's got this one little tail that sticks down, and this one's going to be a little raspier. So, different call. This one has a metal frame. It's a little bit more bendable. The plastic ones, if you bend them too much, they'll snap and then they're useless. So keep that in mind. This is a call that has kind of this metal bridge to keep it off the reeds from sticking to the roof of your mouth. That one sounds a little pitchy to me. But it could just need some use to break it in a little bit. If you don't like that little metal bridge sticking up into the roof of your mouth, I don't blame you. It's a little bit of an adjustment, but the purpose is to keep those reeds from sticking to the top of your mouth. With these calls, like I said, when you're starting out, it's going to be hard to make any sounds. Just kind of put them in your teeth, hold them like that, and just blow. All right, you're blowing across that latex is vibrating because you're just blowing across it. Then kind of work it into your mouth and get it up, and so it's in the the top of your mouth, and do the same thing. Just try to get some stuff to make noise, because that's going to be how you're going to use this. And once you get it positioned, and everybody's mouth is different, and on the calls are different, so you're going to have to experiment. But once you get it so where you're actually making that kind of sound, then you can try manipulating your jaw. And when I'm making these calls with a mouth call, I'm literally taking my tongue from up on the roof of my mouth and just dropping it down. Yo, yo, and I'm moving my jaw. I apologize. I'm reflexively covering my mouth because that's how I call in the woods. But I'm trying to sitting here watching myself going, move your hand, idiot. So these are going to take practice. If you live with somebody, you might drive them crazy. So just keep that in mind. They're great for car drives when you're on your own. You know, download some turkey sounds, take a long car drive, and instead of listening to a podcast, work on your turkey calls when you're by yourself with these, because you might risk relationships practicing these at home. So those are the diaphragm calls. Again, all sorts of cuts, all sorts of colors, all sorts of sizes. Thankfully, they're usually pretty cheap. Find the one that worked for you and go with it. Our wing bone calls, our trumpet calls, these are made out of turkey bones, and you can see these are made out of the wing bones of the turkey. This big bone, that's the humerus, this is the radius, and this is the ulna coming out of those birds. And you can stick them end to end because they're hollow, and they make a nice little trumpet. I don't like calling these trumpet calls because you blow into a trumpet and you suck into these. And when you're sucking into them, you're not doing that. You're just kind of really tightly pursing your lips, and you're just making, it's like you're drinking a milkshake, right? You're just kind of, you're opening your mouth cavity. You're not like really inhaling deeply. You're just kind of going. Now, make these a little raspy. You can make them a little smoother. Different bones will do different things. This is from a hen turkey that was harvested in the fall, and this is from a much bigger tom turkey that was harvested in the spring. And you can see You know, different diameters, different size. Sounds deeper. So there's some variability there. Again, I can't purr with those. With our mouth calls that I was just using, really good ways to purr. You've got a couple of different ways. I know different people purr differently. I use my throat to purr, like I'm gargling. So I know people who can't do that, so they use their lips to purr. So there's different ways you can do it. More than one way to call a turkey. Really good tip in the chat. You know, once I have a bird coming in, I'm not calling. I'm not calling the whole way that they're coming in. All right, like you don't want to call too aggressively. It's better to be sparse with your calling when you're starting out. We all, especially when we're starting, we all like the sound of our own calls a little much. So just dial it back, be conservative, give a couple of calls, let it sit. Let it sit 10, 20 minutes. Give a couple more calls, let it sit. If a bird's coming in, you know, if I've got a tom who's on the line, if I call and he gobbles at me, I'll wait for a second and then I'll call. If he gobbles at me again, I'm done. I'm waiting. Like, that's his signal that he knows where I'm at. He's cut me off, and he'll either come in or he won't. And if he doesn't come in, he may be traveling with birds. I do want to do one more thing, and we'll get to the Q&A. If you can master that wing bone technique of just gentle sort of sucking in on the call, you don't need a wing bone. If you can do that, you can do that with almost anything. I do it with a corncob pipe. Maybe you don't have a corncob pipe sitting around. You can do it with a straw. This is a straw from a fast food place that I cut down to about 4.5 inches. Maybe you don't have a straw because straws kill turtles. Well, you can do it with a ballpoint pen. Just take off the top, take off the end, take out the ink. You got a hollow tube. They'll answer to that if they're fired up. So there's a lot of things that you can do in the woods. It's not nearly as hard as people make it out to be. Again, find the thing that works for you, and you can get birds calling back at you. Craig, how are we doing? We got 10 minutes for questions.
Yep, we got quite a few questions. I've answered some online. The first one I'm going to jump to is Daniel. He says, I live in the Twin Cities suburbs, and there are flocks of wild turkeys in my neighborhood. Is it legal to practice calling to them?
There is an anti-harassment law for wildlife. So, that's you don't want to do it so much that it affects them negatively, right? Like you don't want to don't call them into traffic. That would be bad. That'd be rude. But I've definitely called at birds in the metro, and I've been on bike rides. Because I'm one of those guys that has a turkey call in his pocket frequently, and so if I see birds, I'll give them a couple of calls, just a little yelp yelp yelp, and see what they do. That's your call to that's your call to make. It's just like with anything. Use some common sense. Don't harass the birds. Don't go chasing after them and chase them off into traffic or anything. But yeah, I mean it's a good strategy. I lived in a place that had an arboretum and there were turkeys in there. I'd go out there and practice my calls on them just to see how they would respond. So.
Okay. Is there a standard protocol for the frequency of calling once you establish a conversation with a tom?
So usually those conversations, the conversations with toms are short, right? Like I'll yelp and if he gobbles. And I'm like, okay, so we've done the hey, and he's done the hey, and then I'll wait for a second, and then I'll call again. And if he gobbles and he cuts me off again, that's me going, hey, and him going, I heard you, I know where you're at. And at that point, I stop. And if I haven't heard anything in 15, 20, 30 minutes, I might give some real gentle calls because he might have snuck in. And so I'll do like some real short, soft purrs just to see if he responds, because you would be shocked. Turkeys do turkey things. And, a lot of times they'll circle around the source of the noise. And I've had more than one occasion where I've called and he's gobbled. I've called and he's gobbled. I've stopped. It's been half an hour. I've done these really light little purrs. And 10 feet behind me, there's a gobble. And it freaks you out because you're just completely surprised because he's just snuck in on you. So my conversations with toms are really short. My conversations with hens can be very long and involved and detailed, and I'm really, literally, I'm just, whatever she says, I'm matching. So she's setting the agenda, I'm just answering exactly how she did it, because a lot of people know birds attack their own reflections. They'll do that with audio signals too. They don't like being challenged. And so if she's sitting there going, I'm the boss, and you're sitting there going, I'm the boss, they don't like it. So they're going to come in. So she sets that conversation. Like, I try to match her cadence. I count the number of times she's yelping. I count the pause. I'm trying to match that as much as I can.
Okay. Charlie wants to know, would you select a different call for the type of weapon you're using, shotgun or archery equipment?
That's a great question. I don't archery hunt for turkeys. I only shotgun hunt for turkeys. Most of these, if I was archery hunting for turkeys, because I need to hold my bow with two hands, I would probably be pretty reliant on diaphragm calls. I want that call so that I can have my hands ready and go. Now, if you're in a blind, again, it's situational. I don't hunt in a blind. I sit on the ground, and so I'm very conscious of movement. I want to be as still as I can. If you're in a blind, you can get away with a lot more movement. So yeah, maybe, don't let the fact that you're archery hunting stop you from using a box call if you're already going to be in a blind. You've got time and the ability and the concealment to hit that box call, have a tom come in, put it down, and pick up your bow because you're in a blind. So it really depends on what you have at your disposal and what you're comfortable with.
Okay, Rick wants to know, what sound does a hen turkey make when she's ready to breed?
There are some breeding calls, and I've been turkey hunting for 12 years now, and I think I've heard it once. And so I don't imitate it because I just don't hear it very often, and it's not something that I've encountered a lot. It is out there, and there are some people who swear by breeding calls. It's just, that's not in my realm of experience, and so I don't want to speak to it and throw anybody off, but they are out there, and people do swear by them, just like people swear by their lucky hat and the ammo that they're using, and the brand of the shotgun they're carrying. I mean, people make it work a variety of ways.
Brian wants to know, what's a good cadence? I mean, you talked about being able to mimic the hen call back, but when you're starting out, do you do 3 yelps and then follow up with 4 yelps, or what do you do?
So when I'm first starting out, so I'll go in the woods really early, and when I'm first starting out, I'll sit down near where I think they're roosting. And I think this because I've gone out to an area. When they fly up at night, the toms will gobble before they go to bed. It's like their last little chest thump before they go to sleep, and so they'll let you know where they're going to spend the night, if you can get on them. And so I'll go out, I'll get set up. I try to get set up within 100 yards of the tree. I don't want to get too close because even at night, they'll pick up that movement and they'll not like it. So I try to get within 100 yards, and I'll just sit down and I'll let the woods start waking up. And when I start hearing chickadees and other birds start calling, I'll start thinking about it. But I'm waiting for those hens that are in the trees with the tom, if they're there, to start calling, and I'll just mimic them. They have what's called tree talk, which are these really soft. And I always start off soft because you never know when a bird is behind you. But And that's literally the volume that I would use in the woods. I mean, it's super soft, super quiet. Maybe mix it up for a couple of clucks. And if I don't hear anything after that, I'll wait. I'll just wait and just try to see if I hear any other birds talking and so that I can mimic. But then I'll shift that into a yelp after that, maybe just a little bit louder. So, just that little bit of like, give a couple clucks, give a couple purrs, and it's the, hey, I'm here. Where are other people? Where are the other birds? Other people. Where are the other birds? So that's how I start. And if I haven't heard anything all morning, then yeah, I'll do some pretty loud yelps where it's just. And my Hail Mary, if I haven't heard anything all morning, I'm getting kind of ticked off about it, I'll make sure my pot ball's ready to go, and I'll mimic a little hen fight. And that creates a big ruckus. And if there's any tom that's nearby, they frequently come and check it out. But that's like literally the last thing I do before I'll sit there for about half an hour after that, and I'll get up and I'll go somewhere else. Because at that point, they either heard me and weren't interested, or I've chased them out of the area. So that's my last ditch to get somebody to come in if I haven't heard anything all morning.
So one last quick question here. We are up against 1 o'clock. Any change in the calling between morning and evening?
Not for me. The pattern is always the pattern for me is always start soft, because you never know when there's a bird behind you. Kind of ramp it up. Be cautious with the amount of calling that you're doing. Like I said, especially when you're starting, you're like, oh, I just figured out how to make this mouth call work. I'm going to call all the time, and it's not going to be helpful for you. So be judicious in your application for calling. And yeah, as I start soft, if I don't hear anything, I'll get a little louder. I'll get a little louder. And then if I've been there for 3 or 4 hours and nothing's come in, I'll have a little hen fight and wait and see what shows up. And I'll do that morning and night. But that's, tailor it to where you got. And I did see one quick chat, our locator calls, important to know. They're out there. They're definitely useful. I've got a couple right here. This is an owl call. They work, but so do car alarms and slamming doors. If you're just starting out on this, focus on those turkey calls. You can use that box call as a locator call when they're way in the distance. Some people use Canada goose calls. Some people use coyote, non-electronic coyote calls to get them to what's called shock gobble. They're so pent up with hormones and emotions and aggression that it's like any loud sound. They're like, oh! So those can be useful, and I definitely carry them, but I don't use them very often. And then, Lori, how long would I do a hen fight? Not very long. Turkeys don't live too long when they're making a lot of noise in the woods, so it's usually a pretty quick fight. It's a little yelp, 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 and they get agitated, and then they overlap each other, and then it's just a really big cutting fest, and then it's done. So, you don't want to carry that on for too long, because that's just not what happens in the woods.
I want to take one out of the chat real quick. Matt wanted to know if you could use a gobbler call, and that's really dangerous because you're using it, but the hunter that hears that gobbler may try and stalk a turkey, which isn't recommended, and you could bring a dangerous situation about. With that, guys, we are way over time. So
yep,
thanks
3 minutes over, and thanks everybody for tuning in. And yeah, you got plenty of time to go out and get a call and get some practice in, and Good luck in the woods out there. Be safe, and we will see you around. Thanks so
Good luck,
much.
everybody.